Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us. We have a great session where myself and my esteemed panelists, my colleagues, reflected on what proactive learning truly means in today's day and age. We are navigating uncertainty in a way that is unprecedented from most decision makers in education, in the workspace, in healthcare. There is a reliance on technology today that we simply have not seen before, not to this degree. And we also cannot pretend that technology can solve all of the issues, especially now when we have so many of our students trying to navigate a space where they need to learn using different modalities. And the panel today really delved deep into the role of ICT in higher education and how that is going to connect to career trajectory and employment. And we jointly prepared for this panel so that we reflected on the deep underlying questions to examine the viability and impact of online education and accessibility issues, to really think about underserved youth and vulnerable communities. For myself, having been given the responsibility of leading the Abdullah Al-Khawair Foundation for Education and the Abdulaziz Refugee Education Fund, I am charged with finding partners and solutions to some of the most urgent and pressing issues holding back Arab youth. I'm charged with working with others to cultivate better ecosystems with solutions that will open up quality pathways for those whose life circumstances have reduced their hope for a chance at a better life. Poverty, displacement, statelessness, and a cycle of conflict that they inherited that is robbing them of the right to an education is what keeps me and my team up at night. We have had the amazing fortune of finding partners who share our values and deeply appreciate that the socioeconomic divide also means a digital divide, which today is further widening the education divide given the reliance on ICT for education delivery during a pandemic. To date, I'm proud to say that we have over 80 students in Jordan and Lebanon who have graduated during the pandemic in the last little while from market-driven courses, such as software development, software engineering programs, and of those 75% are employed and the majority remotely. They have not left their communities. And what I hope to collectively explore today with my colleagues are the diversity of models and options that are possible when we collaborate and think differently about proactive learning. When we look at how we can address barriers that can make a difference and allow for greater access to lifelong learning journeys. And so who are these esteemed colleagues? We have Dr. Adrienne Hogebroek, who's the Executive Vice President and Managing Director of Horizon Group at Southern New Hampshire University. He is a frequent speaker on change, innovation, and the future of higher education. And if we were to sum up his raison d'etre in one sentence, it would be that innovation and reimagination are essential to advancing equity and social mobility. So welcome, Dr. Adrienne. We have Dr. Naji Wakim, the Associate Provost and Professor at Zayed University, who has extensive experience in institutional and educational reform, strategic planning, budgeting, assessment. He's also specialized in human capital and capacity development, particularly in the STEM disciplines. And his raison d'etre is serving humanity through education. So welcome, Dr. Naji. We have Tom Wolfe, who's the founder and CEO of EdAid, and he has led high impact businesses in financial services, tech, as well as the education sector with global and regional partners. Tom founded EdAid in 2015. It is a fair, affordable alternative to traditional higher education funding that delivers deferred tuition payment plans for higher education in the UK, US, Canada, Australia, and the Middle East. And his raison d'etre is actually part of what he founded, which is doubling the household income of every student that we support and growing the GDP of students, outcomes that are important. So welcome, Tom. And we also have finally Mike Damiano. He's the director of Coursera for campus across Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. He has extensive experience in e-learning initiatives in the school and higher education sectors and the design of innovative learning opportunities for underserved groups. His raison d'etre is that education is the most powerful weapon by which to change the world. And he freely admits that he borrowed that from Mandela. So welcome, Mike. So the first round of questions, we will need to, of course, address COVID because that is what is on everyone's mind. And so COVID-19 has challenged the existing educational practices and tested our readiness to shift to online or blended learning overnight. Given these challenges, we recognize the need for collaborative joint work. In the UAE, we worked with the Ministry of Education and 9 leading universities to design and launch a private-public sector model called the University Consortium for Quality Online Learning. It's the first of its kind initiative in the region and supports UAE universities to develop high-quality accredited online university programs and make them accessible. And we have the great fortune of having Dr. Naji here, who is actually part of that consortium with Zayed University. And so the first question will go to you, Dr. Naji. Can you speak to the rationale why a federal institution, who arguably does not need to join a consortium, would join and be a leader in the field of online learning in the UAE, and who are the students who will benefit from this move?
Morning. Thank you, Dr. Sonia, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in this panel discussion with such a distinguished group of speakers. First, I'd like to make a couple of points. In many parts of the world, higher education and other sectors are the agents of change, which push their governments towards transformation. However, in the United Arab Emirates, we almost have the opposite situation, where the government is constantly challenging the higher education sector to innovate and evolve. The second point I like to make is that in the new normal, that is post the COVID pandemic, I believe that the quality in-person higher education will become generally unaffordable to a larger segment of the world's population, especially in some parts of the world, like the MENA region. So Zayed University, as you mentioned, is a federal institution in the UAE, along with a select group of public and private institutions in the country, have embraced the online learning model for the longer term in order to afford access for a wider segment of the local and regional populations to a select group of our signature degree programs. We see this initiative as an important part of our mission as a public institution in a country that thrives to have a first-rate education system with a regional impact and a global impact as well. So helping the digital divide gap, address the need for the region, and providing excellence education to the local population is a top priority of this consortium. So we are proud to be part of this consortium, and we feel that the next few years, this model will be for other regions, perhaps outside the MENA area, and the country, the UAE, is very supportive of that, especially in collaboration with the Ministry of Education and the Al Ghurair Education Foundation for Education. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Building on your comment about affordability, I'd like to address my next question to Dr. Hogebroek. Southern New Hampshire University is one of the largest universities in the US, serving over 160,000 students. You focus on the importance of learner centricity as a business case, even as an institution, organization, or corporation seeks new or innovative ways to reach marginalized and vulnerable populations. So my question is, why is it important for SNHU to prioritize students who are marginalized and vulnerable? Are those not often the populations that post-secondary experiences are the most challenging, and perhaps they can't afford it?
Dr. Sonia, thank you. And again, thank you to all that have assembled here today. I think this is a very critical question and an important one, because at Southern New Hampshire University, our mission is to transform lives. And so the answer to your question is, it's within our mission, it's the DNA of the institution to do so. I think another important piece here is that as we talk about affordability, we must understand that affordability is not the sole panacea. And so as we think about the work that we're all doing, as we think about this this environment of COVID, COVID has served as, unfortunately, an accelerant to the online and digital work that many of us have been doing for some time. And so now you're getting different dimensions of quality as we move through this issue. I think a second important piece, as we think about particularly in the United States, there are nearly 40 million people who have some credit but no degree. And so when you look at that population and you wonder about vulnerability, we often think of vulnerability as sort of a deficit. But as we see it at Southern New Hampshire University and as many institutions, and I know much of the work that we collectively are doing, we are really seeking to provide very disciplined pathways and journeys from a learner-centric perspective. And so we might look at this from a demographic perspective, those who are refugees, those who are, marginalized or most vulnerable. But if we look at this from a social impact perspective, if we look at this from social mobility, economic mobility, those that are most vulnerable are typically those who are most marginalized from the post-secondary setting. And so if someone is not picking that fight to win, then who is? And so that's the space and the place that we see ourselves at Southern New Hampshire University.
Thank you for that. I'm reflecting on what you said, and it's really interesting to hear that it's not necessarily about demographics, but about social impact, and to hear that in the US, you have 40 million people with a credit and no degree. It really demonstrates that vulnerability is a global issue.
Mm-hmm.
And when we talk affordability versus, moving social impact, I think the natural next question goes to Tom, which who might be able to talk about the fact that we have seen many scholarship providers shift their focus in the last years because they've recognized that this is not a sustainable solution. It does not serve enough of the vulnerable populations. And Tom, you've made this your life's work. The shift is about finding sustainable solutions to finance affordable quality education and lower the barriers for all. And what I love about some of the models that you've put forward is that these vulnerable populations are not victims, they're not beneficiaries, but they're part of the solution. So I'd love it if you spoke to the models that innovate to providing those better solutions.
I think, Dr. Sonia, it's a pleasure to be here. And I think that what we're seeing as we go through if we take away the kind of more macro picture of the struggles of higher education and the COVID impact, if we just think more broadly than that, tuition fees have been rising year on year, year after year, many hundreds of %. And so it's become that much harder just to even make the on-ramp to get into college, not both through the kind of the academic challenges of getting in, but also the ability to be able to afford to pay up front. And increasingly students outside of the kind of UK, US federal funding systems find it harder and harder because those tuition fees have got more expensive. And so if we take that aside to say, how do we find more accessible ways to on-ramp students to make sure they're at the start line the same? And that often means affordable finance. And so we're constantly trying to look at ways of doing that. And the reliance on scholarship tends to only help a few students, a very select audience. And then there are other universities that will use scholarship or bursary as a discounting mechanism effectively. So it's kind of funny money and actually doesn't solve the problem. And so what we're trying to do, and many others are doing, are looking at ways to build revolving kind of endowments, pots of capital where students are able to start their studies at the same level, the same footing as other students who come from wealthier backgrounds, and then pay for their tuition over time. And then when those funds get paid into the pot, it supports the next student, the next cohort, the next generation. And I think that idea of community capital, of impact capital that's revolving, that isn't based on high interest and funding kind of the debt capital markets or hedge funds, but it's actually based on supporting cohort after cohort. And I think we're seeing now increasing amounts of universities under pressure to use their endowments directly for impact, rather than necessarily to be running hedge funds with a common room on the side of them. And so, we see the role of universities as being incredible civic organizations that have the ability to be able to create pathways for those that sit in the lower quartiles of the economic pyramid, but that's where some of the greatest minds and the greatest change makers sit. And so for us, it makes great business sense for universities to be able to broaden their enrollment, to enable more students from diverse backgrounds to be able to come in, diversity of thinking, diversity of race and gender, and particularly diversity of economic background, to be able to get access. And once they do, they pay for their tuition alongside everyone else. So everybody pays, everybody realizes the value of the education they're getting, and they pay back into the pot for subsequent generations. There's some income share agreement models, there's some deferred tuition, there's some study now, pay later models, but all of them focus around the same thing. The university has skin in the game, the student has skin in the game. There isn't third-party capital that's profiting off the student and the university in a kind of abstract and asynchronous way. And so we see these kind of shared risk, shared reward models as the way forward for higher education.
Thank you, Tom. I think that that this is a game changer on our expectations of institutions of higher education. And in innovating and looking at these different models, I mean, I'm really excited to hear from Coursera, because when I think about what you're saying and the 40 million, in addition to the degrees, what Coursera offers are certificates and courses with hundreds of learning universities and companies. So really bringing that all to a single platform and giving greater access. So the perceptions about online learning have changed due to COVID, and it became a more viable education portal for the underserved and working populations, so that lower branch and allowing them to become part of a solution, not just be part of a problem. So I'm really curious, Mike, do you have a new profile of applicants from this period? Is there a relationship between the increase in Coursera's enrollment and people working from home, trying to formalize their upscaling journey?
So Dr. Sonia, thank you for the opportunity, and great to be here with these esteemed colleagues. I think Coursera certainly saw an increase of learners over 2020. We had something like 30 million new learners join the platform. And there were a large number who were fairly new to online learning. It's not just the learners, but actually the educators too, schools and colleges and universities, as well as companies and agencies. They had to rapidly switch to online learning and training. And I think you're right to say perceptions have changed. So many of these groups in the past might have been quite resistant to online or blended learning, but COVID has been a really significant change agent. And a lot of people have been surprised how effective online and blended can be. And I like to think about it in a way that the online learning genie, she's really out of the bottle, and I don't think she's going back. And in terms of a profile of new learners and what they're learning, it looks slightly different whether they're in employment or not. So those in employment have been taking more personal development courses. Yale's A Science of Wellbeing is probably our most popular course on the platform. Whereas those who are looking to enter, or re-enter the workforce, and unfortunately we have many of those right now, they've been focusing on learning the digital skills like data science and computer science and information technology, the skills that are most in demand from employers. And I think the increase in enrollment is probably less about people working from home. So I work from home, I also have a 5-year-old who was out of school for much of that time. So I don't think my online learning has increased that dramatically. But I think it's probably more of a combination of large groups of learners who are being presented with new ways of learning and recognizing that gaining new skills is becoming, more important than ever. We've got this double disruption of the acceleration of automation. I think it's almost an acceleration of acceleration now. And add to that the impact of COVID. I mean, it's huge. The World Economic Forum estimates that 40% of core skills will change for workers within the next 5 years. I mean, that's really no time at all. So employers want people who can demonstrate they have cutting edge skills. And many of those people are coming to Coursera to gain those skills.
Thank you. If I could ask Dr. Adrian, I want to touch on something you said, Mike, which is about student well-being, because that's often overlooked in these discussions. And it's interesting that you bring that up. And I know from previous discussions how important addressing student well-being on a consistent basis is to SNHU's models and its success. So would you mind speaking a minute on that, Dr. Adrian?
That's it's a phenomenon that I think is global, that we have seen an increase in vulnerability in our learners and students across all programs and across all modalities. And so a lot of the effort that we put forward obviously is a very service-oriented mentality. And so we really, in that learner-centric paradigm, we do focus heavily on the learner and providing the supports that are necessary to help them sort of glide through their journey. But even with the pandemic, it was so exponential in terms of how those vulnerabilities express themselves that we actually have built in new resources to really to address those. And because of some of the regulatory and compliance issues that we have in the United States, you can't, and obviously our student base is across the country and across the world, those compliance and regulations don't often afford you the opportunity to provide direct support, say for mental health types of issues. And so we see this as, well, we've got to find a solve for that. And so we have actually embedded a new service that allows for that, those connections to actually happen, for Adrian, who might live in California, to a link with resources in my state. So therefore, the compliance issues, we're still abiding by them, but we're still providing those direct support to our students. And we're seeing the very same thing, even though we on our physical campus, many people may not realize that we have about a 3,500 student physical, traditional kind of bucolic New England campus. And although we have been remote for this entire year, we were still finding and surveying and finding that our students who were more prone to the residential environment were also escalating in their vulnerabilities. And so we put some supports around that as well. So I can't express it enough. That is one of the top 2 issues in American higher education. And I would extract that to potentially even say globally.
I'll echo that. Definitely globally in our scholarship program, we have definitely seen heightened needs for addressing student well-being, and we've reached out to the universities and provided ourselves. So it's definitely something that is critical to success. And on that note, I'm going to actually move this conversation, because in terms of everything that we have to do to support and assure success and increase access, I really want to make sure that we address the idea of leveraging quality online education in a sustainable and viable economic model. And so in developing countries, online learning is the enabler for economic development and poverty reduction. With AGFE's consortium example, we're in line with the country's vision for a knowledge-based economy. The UAE is really clear about that. We focus on heightened needs for high quality, accredited, flexible, and affordable online platforms. And I'm really curious, Dr. Naji, from an institutional perspective, it's really interesting because this is not common practice that 9 competing universities would actually stop, set back, and seriously collaborate in a joint work model to really find scalable solutions for the region. And so does this work when competitors become collaborators?
Yes, yes, it can work. First, the 9 institutions that you mentioned are the best in the nation and some of the best in the region. So they are also, as we mentioned, they're also led and supported by the Ministry of Education, and of course a reputable foundation, the Alvarado Education Foundation. So they all have solid experience in higher education as providers in this region. Second, these 9 institutions are also working collaboratively and in a complementary way. Yes, they might compete locally, and they do have overlapping programs, but in this consortium, we really look at it as one education provider. So as a consortium, we collectively offer we will offer a diverse menu of high quality accredited programs that are signature degree programs at each of these respective institutions. So in a way, it's will be a complementary set of programs that provided collectively by the various institutions to a wider audience. So since these programs will be available to local, regional, and international audiences, the financial model will allow the cost of these programs to be more affordable to students. Furthermore, the model is scalable because more institutions can be added to the consortium in the future, and it could be within the country or outside. More programs will be introduced, and consequently, more students will be served. So it will be scalable, will be expandable, will be affordable, and the educational model that it offers, more importantly, will be providing higher education that meets international standards with local and regional flavors. There are certain programs that this consortium will offer that would be difficult for other competing institutions outside the consortium to offer and compete with. For example, a program like in international affairs and diplomacy, which focuses on the Gulf region, the oil and gas industry. So clearly, international affairs, diplomacy is a broad topic offered at many institutions around the world. But when it's offered by an institution within this consortium, will also give it the local and regional flavor that it deserves, which might attract students not only from the region, but also from international audiences. Thank you.
Thank you. I will actually think about how that relates back to Dr. Adrian, and I want to look at how we do expand what we know and work with others and create new models, which is what I think, Dr. Naji, that's what you're really talking about at the heart of it. And I know that NSHU is launching a new unit called the Social Impact Collective. And so how would you define this work, and how does it fit within the university's business imperative?
Sure. So if you go back to what I shared earlier about our mission to transform lives, then if you're really fulfilling the mission and looking at it from a learner-centric view, then again, we're trying to solve problems that are sometimes very difficult to solve. So we're a scaled university. And not just because we're serving 160,000 plus learners, that's one sort of output, but we're also scaled in the context of infrastructure, from a leadership capacity, from capabilities, from the technology platform and all of those things. So we are scaled to be able to serve a large number of learners and students. But even in that scaled enterprise, we are finding that there's some vulnerabilities that we cannot serve well through those scaled efficiencies. And so we built this social impact collective as a way for us to really invest in smaller scale solutions for populations or vulnerabilities that we have found are not served best in a scaled environment. So those investments then allow us to experiment, to do things on a much smaller scale, not the 160,000, but 1,000, 2,000. And so if you look at the work that we're doing with our global education movement, where we are working with learners in refugees in camps and displaced environments, that's a smaller scale solution that our incumbent organization couldn't solve for from an efficiency perspective. And so we make the investment to find the solve there. And then what we do is we take the learnings and the findings and we bridge that back into our enterprise, because we feel that if we can solve for those vulnerabilities, then we can bring that back into the larger scope of work to find ways to solve for other problems as well. And so it allows us to do that kind of experimentation. It allows us to do the kinds of public-private partnerships and collaborations we were talking about earlier. And again, it allows us to really see the nature of the investment that we're making, or investments that we're making, back to the mission and the vision of our efforts.
Thank you for that. I was wondering, can you follow up and talk to us a little bit about your relationship with Kenzie Academy?
Yeah, so one of the, as I shared earlier, the demand in the United States, and as we're indicating here on the panel, it is global. The demand for accelerated or advanced learning is phenomenal. And so one of the untapped markets in the United States, and particularly thinking about post-secondary, is the non-degree market, and really thinking about the work and the efforts that relate to on-demand skills and what employers and workforce are looking for. So there's a new phrase that I've just come across more recently. It's called new collar jobs. And these new collar jobs are essentially very mobile kinds of opportunities that don't require a 4-year degree. And so what we're beginning to see even more, and you've seen it probably more in the news with Google and Microsoft, where they're actually developing their own quote universities as such, where they're actually developing pathways for very quick, high levels of competency, technical skill development, and is bridging straight into job and career opportunities. And so the demand is great. And so our work with Kenzie is our attempt to really, again, thinking about the demands of the learners and thinking about learner centricity, is our attempt to really begin understanding the non-degree market and how that can build and bridge into more populations, or in the depth of populations where, for those who are not being served well in post-secondary.
And I would think that that would mean making sure that you do outreach to the business sector, to the employers. And, Tom, I'll glue that question to you. As an alternative lending platform that gives students access to affordable university studies, how have your partnerships with institutions benefited the employment and business sector? How can the educational sector stakeholders collaborate to make that bridge stronger and have a better impact in terms of livelihoods? Because you do talk about doubling the household income, and that means jobs and employment.
It's a huge role. I think for many years, the academic sector has seen higher education as academic enlightenment, as tradecraft, as a great way to think, and a pathway to academia, and the business models being created around that. But actually, increasingly, the students that we see, those that come from lower income households, want to be able to level up. They want to be able to get a better job. These emergent industries that Dr. Hogerbert just far more eloquent than me that spoke about. We need to be able to provide the on-ramps to education, but also the off-ramps to business. That pathway to employability, that pathway to leveling up is as important as the subject the students study. If there is no outcome, then the study for the majority of students in these shorter intensive courses is largely wasted time. And so what we try to do is listen to employers and actually center the employer in the crafting of the course itself. So if you look at the Kenzies of this world, the General Assembly is owned now by the Adecco Group. And what it does really well is it brings in all of its employers and says, what do you need from our graduates we're creating at a General Assembly? And then reshapes the curriculum on a quarterly basis for those graduates. And for those in the higher education centre know to get a course designed, built and certified can sometimes take up to 5 years of a rolling basis of certification. Well, the employment market has moved on 20 times in that 5 years. And what we see now, if you a simple search on Indeed, even just in the region, will list many millions of technology jobs across the region. And yet we also have many millions unemployed. And so what these boot camps, if we take the kind of wartime analogy, what they do is they get troops ready for the demands of the world environment today. And I think if we take the idea of the impact of COVID, how do we get the troops, people who are unemployed now, ready for the demands of employers today, knowing those demands will change in 36 months so they can continuously level up? They'll actually maybe do a boot camp now and pick up another boot camp in 3, 4, 5 years time and then pick up another one. So rather than say a 36, 48 month chunk of learning when they're younger after leaving high school in the K-12 system, they will probably do a continuum where they'll do 5 or 6 3-month boot camps over the course of a 20, 30-year career, which means they'll stay relevant, they'll stay in economically empowering jobs, and they'll be able to level up at significant kind of points in their career.
I see Dr. Adrian nodding his head, so I'm going to give him the mic. You have things to say.
No, I just loved everything that Tom spoke to. Economic empowering ways, thinking about those short bursts of learning, talking about micro credentials, individualized pathways, where the learner actually has the opportunity to be the curator of his or her own learning. And then being able to intentionally match that with work skills. I was on a panel last week, and one of the panelists said, not only is this a venue for post-secondary to step into, but it's also a basis for the liberal arts in post-secondary as well. She had talked about it in terms of soft skills, and I said, we talk about it in terms of enduring skills. And so there's a lot of room to play for the post-secondary sector that links to exactly what all of us are talking about. But yeah, I was nodding the whole time Tom was speaking.
The other person who was nodding vehemently was Dr. Naji, and I know that he is an advocate for this micro-credentialing and leveling up, and the institute. I mean, you've got to think, EdAid, Coursera, like such different contexts that a federal established institution, and I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Dr. Naji, one of the oldest in the country, still thinking about the same things because you're all thinking about the needs of the students. So would you mind speaking a little bit about that?
Sure. I think we're not that different from the rest of the world. I think there are a lot of interest in new ways and innovative ways, and micro-credentialing is definitely one of the areas that everybody's exploring. I think stackable learning, whatever, the different things that are emerging, eventually, in my opinion, they call for defining a new degree construct. Yes, of course. I mean, there's a degree, there's what's called non-degree learning that is a huge sector out there for people who don't want a college degree or definitely have a college degree or university degree and now want to continue to learn, lifelong life learning and so on and so forth. But for the traditional learning, and I think this is where the innovation needs to happen, is that we really have to rethink what a degree means and how a degree is constructed, and who has the role to customize. And this is where the student comes into play. And the advent of the online learning, I think, will provide new opportunities for the customer, for the student, to be more proactive in that process, rather than, you know, choosing between one template or another. Is that now the student can really customize his or her degree to the extent they want, and they can also be afforded the mobility. You know, also we live in a world right now where it's no guarantee that many people are going to be in their place for a certain period of time, especially for graduate education. In my opinion, is that that's where the innovation is also needed.
Thank you for that. And I mean, when it comes to, you know, picking and choosing courses and putting together a patchwork of whatever you want to learn, I think Coursera might be the beast in the room, who have allowed this to happen globally and given options. I know I've taken advantage of trying to level up myself. So Mike, you know, not only have you guys done that, but you've done it in an economically viable model. And I think that that is a great example that if you think differently, there's something there. And so I want you to speak a little bit, if you can, about what is it that distinguishes your model from other online learning programs?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Sonia. I think everything I'm hearing really resonates. I mean, the fact that employers are looking at skills in addition or separately to degrees. I think Wiley just produced a report that said, you know, 90% of employees are saying that they'll look at micro-credentials, certifications, and think about those before they think about degrees for jobs. I think in terms of differentiation, I think it starts with our vision, and our vision is that anyone, anywhere has the power to transform their lives through learning. I've already heard that transformation message mentioned today. And so what we try to do is create ways for learners to access the very best job relevant online learning from any of our partners. And we've got many university and industry partners. So whether you're an individual coming to the platform looking to reskill for a new career, or if you're an employee accessing through our Coursera for Business platform, or if you're a part of a workforce recovery initiative with one of our government clients, or maybe you're coming to us through our Coursera for Refugees program. So we're trying to reach learners wherever they are. And something we're particularly excited about is working with colleges and universities to bring Coursera to their students and faculty. And we're seeing universities integrating Coursera into their curriculum, and it's having a really big impact on student experience and employability. And actually the AGFE's consortia that Dr. Naji was speaking about, I mean, I applaud that. When we see collaboration rather than competition across different institutions, in public and private, we really see innovation accelerating. And I think in terms of differentiation, I think there's probably three things that distinguish our model. The content, I mean, I'm glad, Dr. Sonia, that you've experienced it. I think it's truly incredible. It's super high quality, it's really job relevant, it's affordable, it's flexible. Dr. Holgerbrook mentioned the Google Gateway certificates, and additional 3 have just been launched. And this isn't just about getting a job at Google. Many would like that. This is about, you know, getting jobs that employers demand skills for. So, and we have this concept. We've talked a lot about micro credentials. I think too, we've got this concept of stackable learning. So on Coursera, you can take guided projects, which are hands-on learning projects that can take maybe 1 or 2 hours. You can go into our more traditional courses, which might take a few weeks, our specializations, which might take a few months, and then going right up to full degrees. So that self-directed learning pathways, learners can do that. But they can also work with their institutions, whether they're, you know, government employers, universities, colleges, to curate courses for them depending on their job aspirations or their learning pathways. And I think best of all, Coursera sits in the middle of this huge ecosystem. So we've got 200 or so university and industry partners. We have 6,000 institutes around the world, companies, governments, and universities. We've got nearly just over 77 million learners. And that gives us access to an incredible amount of data. So we know what skills learners want to gain. we know what skills employers are looking for, and we can use that information to inform what content needs are, and then we can go to our partners to ask that content to be developed. So it's a really virtuous cycle. And it's interesting to hear, it's 5 years to get a program up and running, but by the time you're in your 5th year, what you were learning in the first year is out of date. So having flexible, innovative, stackable models of learning are becoming more and more important.
Thank you. It's really interesting, because what your nugget, I think the foundation is that you are trying to meet context specific labor market needs that can address unemployment as a critical pathway and give people the support where they need it, which is what Tom was talking about earlier. As you move through, you change, and then you realize you need more things, or you realize which pathway you want to take. And, when I look at my region, online learning for underserved Arab youth can reach the most vulnerable, provided cost-effective programs, flexibility to study online while working, widening the pool of beneficiaries, as long as we also give that digital ecosystem and policy ecosystem what they need. But, what we need is a deep understanding and support of the full education to employment cycle if we're going to deal face to face with that unemployment challenge and make a difference and meet the needs of an already stressed labor market in our region. And when I hear you talking about looking at the skills data and how you can make job relevant programming, or actually go to governments, or actually go to industry and say, by the way, did you know? I'd really love to hear more about how your institution is working responsibly with using data to close the gap between universities and corporates, because I think Coursera does a really good job of that.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Sonia. I think this is one of the most important things that Coursera can do with and for the higher education sector. We're tracking over 40,000 skills which are mapped to our courses, and that means we can follow what skills are those nearly 80 million learners, those 77 million learners are gaining on our platform, and we've got a really deep knowledge of the skills that are in demand by employers. Actually, we use this data to publish an annual report, the Global Skills Index, which I'd encourage folks to take a look at. It looks at skills across various industries and various countries, and it paints a picture of where some may be lagging or leading. And in universities specifically, we're looking at the data that the 2.3 million university students that use Coursera for Campus over the past year, and we've been able to go even further. We just published a new report 2 weeks ago, I think, called The Unbounded University. And this is specifically looking at that challenge, the gap between the skills gap between education and employment. So we've been able to explore the skills proficiency gap between students and working professionals in specific fields and areas of study. It's super insightful. And as an example, a platform can tell us, what jobs engineering students really want, and the gap down to the number of study days needed between their current skill level and what working professionals in that in that field, the skills level they have. So one of the stats, for example, is the average engineering student is going to need an additional nearly a semester of study to close the skills gap for software engineering. And so I'd really encourage any university leader to make that report available to their deans, to their heads of career services, because it's some really insightful data. And we actually also use this data when working with university customers. So our customers have got access to dashboards that allow them to track the skills, not just of their learners, but of their faculty and staff as well. And not just within their institution, but they can benchmark across institutions and industries. So this can help them and us working with them design appropriate learning pathways or curations of courses that can address skills gaps specifically for groups of students and for local employers, or in fact for global employers, because there's now this great opportunity for people to stay in region and still be working for global employers that may not necessarily be in region. So we're really excited about being able to sit down and work with university leaders to develop some of those learning pathways.
And Mike, all of that is free from Coursera, and it's posted and it's online, the ebook and
Yep.
that stuff. So that's, this is really very, very relevant information that you can get without having to hire a consulting company to tell you. So I think that's very adaptive for what is needed. It's really interesting because I hear you, and then I think last night I was talking to Dr. Jeffrey Armstrong from Cal Poly, and we were talking about the fact that not everything can go online. And, Dr. Naji, when I think about what you're about to do, a hybrid learning solution may be the most inclusive, viable model, for learners. So how do we find the balance, and how can universities prepare themselves, adapt and deliver a new model that might need to be hybrid because not everything can be online?
Indeed. I think one of the best lessons learned by many institutions from the COVID pandemic, especially the newcomers to e-learning, like Zayed University, is that online education may not be the best modality for all students at all educational levels, and even in all programs, especially those academic disciplines that are more lab-based or studio-based, like physical sciences, life sciences, some areas of those, as well as the arts. So clearly, we need to have different venues that are best suited for the different requirements and clientele. So the new models will require collaboration and partnerships, public and private, because no one institution will be able to address all needs. I mean, that's so important. And I think anyone that tried to do it all will definitely fail. So the hybrid learning model seems to be the way forward for many universities that offer a comprehensive set of programs to a diverse student population. There is also a need to re-examine as I mentioned before, what a university degree should be like in the future, which may lead to a new degree construct. That's why I said earlier that the consortium will offer a select set of programs targeting specific students at particular educational level. This is to ensure that standards of quality and the learning outcomes are not compromised when a particular course or program is offered online. So finally, I mean, we've been focusing a lot on primarily on the student or the learner. I also should note that we must not underestimate the level of preparation and training needed for the faculty who will teach online. Especially in an asynchronous learning model. In my opinion, a sizable investment would need to be made in faculty professional development, especially in the initial stage when such programs are rolled out, and potentially long-term, a new support system or support structure, technical support, all kind of support, administrative support, 24/7 kind of thing for the longer term. So definitely, whether it's fully online, whether it's synchronous, asynchronous, hybrid, there are quite a bit of changes that the institution would have to go through.
And it's really interesting because we did start talking about students and now we're talking about institutional level, but what makes me think is, there's such a diversity of models coming in the pipeline, and quality assurance is such a big piece of that. And we're increasing corporate, involvement and engagement. And Tom, I know you've got some very strong opinions about this. What is the role of traditional accreditation as we move to international online models, and what's the role of corporate in that?
I think we've touched upon many things. I think that the power needs to shift back towards the student, and actually, institutions. I think that over the last many years, we've seen institutions that tuition fee revenue as a percentage of revenue for universities has fallen, as research funding, as corporate partnerships, as all the other kind of elements of buildings and lettings and student hall revenue has risen. And so we've seen this mix effectively of these universities becoming these large buildings with hedge funds bolted on the back of them, and actually not focus back on the student. What the student needs is a credential which is going to lead to a market signal, which is going to get them hired in a better job. And effectively, if you speak to, I think, 9 out of 10 students, that's what they're looking for. And so the power needs to shift back to the student as the driver of the reason why the institutions, many of which are public institutions, i.e. non-profits, and therefore the public good. And therefore they should be back, the centricity should shift back to the good of the student and the outcomes, rather than necessarily serving the corporate desires of the institution. And so, we speak to students, we'll support about 30,000 students this year, and every single one of them is going to their academic institution to get a better job, to get hired, to level up and get that credential, which is going to be a signal to the likes of Google, to Microsoft, to get a better job. But also on the employer side, what we're hearing every single day from employers is actually sometimes the credential is less important than students that aren't fragile, that can craft an email properly, that know how to use Salesforce, because there's not many jobs in the world that don't involve selling, whether it's internally or externally, and that virtually the entire world runs on Salesforce, that knows how to build out their LinkedIn profile. The first thing students should know when they arrive on campus in any program is how to send an invite or request to someone on LinkedIn, which isn't just like connect with no context. And we've all had it. I've had 15 LinkedIn requests on this call, and not a single one has had an intro saying why they've reached out. And so if we're not teaching fundamental, I apologies whoever mentioned it beforehand on this call, but the basic kind of human critical thinking skills that actually give us connective tissue, how to reach out, how to communicate, how to craft an email, how to be useful in the room in a meeting, and keep your mouth quiet and take notes and share them succinctly to everybody, and then respond in quick time to people on emails. That's what employers need. They'll shape the individuals to what they actually need. And when we look at the credential is a way to get in the door. It's always been a way to get in the door. It's been a bit of a caste system over the years, and great platforms like Coursera and SNHU and what the Zayed University are doing now is creating these new signals, these micro signals, these new ways of breaking down the door. But once you're in, you need to be able to write an email properly, communicate effectively, and cut all the BS that most people think jobs are about, and actually get stuff done.
I know Adrian would like to respond, so I'll let him respond, then I'll close.
So I'll just respond quickly with that. Again, love what exactly what Tom said. So, if we talk about the institution, think of two things. One, institutions are organized for a linear progression for a student. So the student actually has to come into the institution. The second thing is the thing that is currently the constant is that we have fixed that time is the constant, and learning, it happens around that time. So what if we were truly learner-centric and we really understood the life cycle of the student experience? Institutions wouldn't be shaped the way that they are. They would actually be shaped around the student, not in a linear. And what about if we flip the equation where learning became the constant and time was the flexible dynamic? So that would be an interesting thought.
Amen.
I actually love that idea. As somebody who was trained as a teacher originally and was in a classroom, I think that what we're seeing now is so much uncertainty and chaos that we're actually watching these ideas manifest and rise to the top because time is no longer working. What we've known in the past is no longer working. And so what's wonderful about this time is that the new innovations, the true innovations that serve those who need our help can surface. And I want to thank each of you for really delving deep into the ideas and really exploring the differences. And I think that this could go on for another conversation, so we will revisit. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you, Dr. Sonia.
Thanks.